The icy December wind cut through the rusted frame of an old sedan, its windows decorated with delicate frost patterns. Inside, wrapped in a tattered blanket, Emily stirred restlessly. At 25, she never imagined her life would spiral to this point, calling the front seat of a broken-down car home. As dawn crept in, Emily's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the frost-covered glass. Her breath appeared in soft clouds, the chill seeping through the blanket. She held it tighter, savoring the last moments of warmth before confronting the brutal reality of a new day. Her car was tucked away behind the Silver Spoon, an upscale bistro that unknowingly kept her afloat. This alley had been her refuge for the past 6 months, a place hidden from prying eyes, yet close enough to the scraps that sustained her. Emily sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her back from the cramped space. She reached for her most cherished possession, a chipped, white melamine plate salvaged from a dumpster. To most, it was worthless. To Emily, it was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of life, she still clung to small symbols of normalcy. She glanced around the car's interior, a fragile world she had crafted to resemble a home. Clothes carefully folded on the passenger seat, toiletries lined the dashboard, and a small pile of blankets served as a makeshift bed. It wasn't much, but it was hers. With a deep breath, Emily braced herself for the cold. She had been wearing the same clothes for 5 days, the fabric rough against her skin. Wrapping the thin blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, she grabbed the plate and stepped out. The first gust of frigid air made her gasp, her breath visible as snowflakes drifted from the dull sky. She shuffled through the snow, her feet crunching softly against the ground, making her way to the rear entrance of the Silver Spoon. As she approached, her eyes met those of Jason, the bistro's kitchen hand. Over time, they had developed an unspoken understanding. Without a word, he nodded and motioned to the trash bag he had left deliberately by the door instead of inside the bin. Jason's small but consistent gestures felt like lifelines in Emily's isolated world. She offered a faint smile, her lips cracked from the cold. Without hesitation, Jason slipped back into the warmth of the bistro, leaving Emily alone with her breakfast. Crouching on the damp concrete, she untied the black bag. Experience had taught her that mornings often held the best treasures. Today did not disappoint. Discarded pastries, fresh vegetables, all untouched and perfectly edible. Carefully, Emily arranged her finds on the melamine plate, treating the meal with reverence. Despite her circumstances, she preserved rituals of dignity where she could. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, mentally cataloging the freshness of the discarded goods. As she ate, her thoughts drifted back to how she ended up here. It wasn't sudden, more like a series of falling dominoes. A lost job, her mother's battle with cancer, the mounting bills, the eviction that followed. One by one, life's securities had unraveled. Still, Emily refused to let despair consume her. Somewhere deep inside, she believed she would find her way back. By the time she finished her breakfast, the city around her was waking. The hum of distant traffic filled the air, blending with the soft rustling of snow. Emily wiped the plate meticulously with the edge of her sleeve, determined to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. Her attention returned to the trash bag. She sifted carefully through its contents, her fingers numb. At last, they closed around something familiar. Her phone. It was part of the arrangement. Every night, Jason charged it discreetly inside the bistro and slipped it back into the garbage bag by morning. It wasn't just a phone. It was her tether to the world beyond the alley. A reminder that she hadn't always been like this. After securing the bag, Emily walked back to her car. She cleaned the phone screen with the hem of her blanket, wiping away food residue and grease. As she unlocked the screen, her heart skipped when she saw a message notification. The message was from Clearview Domestic Services, the maid agency she had registered with months ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The message had come late the previous night. Clearview Domestic Services had been a sporadic lifeline for Emily over the past 6 months, offering occasional cleaning jobs that helped her scrape by. This new offer was for weekend work at an address she didn't recognize, but it required her uniform, a detail that lifted her spirits, if only slightly. Back at her car, Emily popped the trunk, revealing a neatly wrapped uniform preserved in plastic. A lump formed in her throat as she ran her hand over the crisp fabric. Despite living in her car, she had fought to keep this one symbol of professionalism intact. Jason, the kitchen hand, had helped her launder it just last week, sneaking it through the bistro's machines. As Emily unwrapped the uniform, the scent of detergent wafted up, clean, fresh, and so distant from her current reality. She clung to that smell, allowing it to remind her of a life that once felt normal. Changing inside her car was an awkward dance of folding limbs and maneuvering in tight spaces. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, stiff and structured compared to the worn clothes she had lived in for days. Yet as she buttoned the blouse and smoothed the skirt, Emily saw a flicker of the woman she used to be. Sliding into the driver's seat, her gaze drifted to the fuel gauge. The needle hovered precariously close to empty. Emily's heart sank. A quick mental tally confirmed she didn't have enough to fill the tank and still keep money for her mother's medication. After a moment's hesitation, she shut off the engine. "I'll walk," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel as if to hold on to hope. Locking the car behind her, Emily began the long trek toward the address listed in the message. The walk was bitterly cold, but she pressed forward, each step carrying her further from the alley and closer to a life she desperately wished to reclaim. With every mile, Emily allowed herself to dream. Maybe this would lead to steady work. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the first stone in the bridge back to stability. She scolded herself for hoping, but hope had become her quiet companion on nights when the cold gnawed at her bones. By the time she arrived, Emily's cheeks were flushed from exertion, her breath visible in the crisp air. She paused, gazing up at the sprawling villa before her. Its grandeur felt like something out of a different world. She tugged at her uniform, straightening it as if that simple act could bridge the chasm between the life she led and the one behind those gates. Taking a steadying breath, Emily approached the entrance. A security guard stepped forward, eyeing her up and down. "Staff entrance is around back," he said, jerking his thumb toward a less elaborate section of the building. "Thank you," she murmured, ducking her head. Circling the property, Emily found the service entrance buzzing with activity. Maids moved swiftly, their crisp uniforms and immaculate appearances making her suddenly aware of every wrinkle and scuff on her own. She hovered by the doorway, unsure of where to go or who to report to. "You," a sharp voice barked. Emily turned to find a tall man approaching with quick, precise steps. His eyes, dark and discerning, scanned her from head to toe. "You must be the new temp. I'm Greg Carver, the supervisor." His gaze lingered a beat too long on her unkempt hair and scuffed shoes. Emily's face burned with shame. No amount of tugging at her uniform could erase the reality of her situation. Greg's nose wrinkled. "We can't have you working like this," he motioned to a nearby maid. "Bring body wash and shampoo. Now." Within moments, the items were shoved into Emily's hands. "Shower. Wash your hair. Tie it back properly. 15 minutes. The other maids avoided her gaze, pretending not to hear the exchange. Embarrassment clawed at Emily, but beneath it flickered gratitude. A real shower, something she hadn't experienced in months, was a gift, even if it came wrapped in humiliation. "What are you waiting for?" Greg snapped, breaking her thoughts. 14 minutes. Emily rushed to the staff washroom, her cheeks flaming. As the hot water cascaded over her, she bit back tears, scrubbing away weeks of grime with trembling hands. The sensation of being clean, of shedding the layers of exhaustion and dirt, overwhelmed her. She washed her hair twice, savoring the lather. Exactly 15 minutes later, Emily emerged, her hair neatly secured beneath her cap. The uniform no longer felt out of place. It fit her in more ways than one. Greg met her with a cursory glance. His only response was a short nod. "Follow me." Emily emerged from the staff bathroom, her hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. The warmth of the shower still lingered on her skin, and for the first time in months, she felt almost human again. Standing among the line of maids, she listened attentively as Greg Carver, the villa's stern supervisor, barked out the day's schedule. "Listen up." Greg's sharp voice sliced through the morning bustle. "We have 2 events today. A luncheon this afternoon and an important networking event tonight. I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you." His eyes scanned the group before settling on Emily. "You, new girl," he said brusquely, You'll be sweeping the patio and cleaning the pool. Simple work, but crucial. Don't mess it up." Emily nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She could handle this. She had to handle this. Even small tasks meant pay, and pay meant another lifeline for her mother's medical bills. With the other maids scattering to their assignments, Emily retrieved her tools from the supply closet. A garden broom and a lawn pool skimmer. The sun climbed higher as she stepped out onto the sprawling back patio, the sheer beauty of the space momentarily taking her breath away. The manicured lawn stretched endlessly, framing a crystal-clear pool that glistened under the sunlight. Elegant furniture dotted the terrace, a sharp contrast to the concrete alley Emily usually called home. She swept the stone tiles carefully, taking her time with each stroke. As the cold air nipped at her face, she found peace in the rhythmic motion. For a few hours, her worries faded into the background, replaced by the simple satisfaction of doing a job well. By the time she moved on to the pool, Emily felt a rare flicker of confidence. She wasn't just a homeless woman in a uniform, she was part of something. Even if only for a weekend, she skimmed the water meticulously, dried leaves and flower petals accumulating in the net. The afternoon sun glimmered off the rippling surface, and for a fleeting moment, Emily felt almost normal. Then, something caught her eye. Near the deep end of the pool, a glint of metal shimmered beneath the water. Emily frowned, stepping closer to the edge. The object, small, circular, and polished, rested near the bottom, far too pristine to be random debris. Jewelry. Her heart quickened. This wasn't ordinary pool litter. Someone must have dropped it during a previous event, unaware of their loss. Emily hesitated. Retrieving it could show her attentiveness, perhaps proving her worth to Greg. But if she fished for it and made a mistake, she could damage it, or worse, get blamed for trying to steal it. Swimming wasn't an option. She couldn't risk ruining her uniform or showing up drenched in the frigid air. Emily knelt by the pool, her mind racing for solutions. Moments later, she hurried back to the supply closet. Her eyes scanned the shelves until she spotted a telescopic hook and a pool brush. Gathering both, she returned to the water's edge. Extending the brush into the pool, Emily carefully maneuvered it towards the submerged object. The bracelet shifted slightly, glinting as sunlight pierced through the water. One wrong move, and it could slip out of reach. Biting her lip, Emily guided the jewelry closer to the edge, inch by inch. Once it was near enough, she switched to the hook. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered it into the pool, gently looping it around the bracelet. Time slowed. The hook caught. With painstaking care, Emily raised the item from the water. Droplets cascaded from the delicate links, glittering in the afternoon light. As the bracelet settled into her palm, Emily's heart skipped. It was exquisite, gold, with small gems embedded along the chain. Turning it over, her fingers brushed against an engraving inside the band. Squinting, she read the name etched into the metal. Lucas Reed. Her breath caught. Lucas Reed, the renowned actor. Emily's knees wobbled. Was this his villa? Was she working for Lucas Reed? For a long moment she stood frozen at the pool's edge, the bracelet heavy in her palm. Her fingers tightened instinctively around it as nervous energy surged through her veins. She had to return it, immediately. Wiping the bracelet carefully with the hem of her uniform, Emily polished away the faint traces of pool water until the gold gleamed. Her heart pounded. The thought of facing Lucas Reed, or even Greg, filled her with dread. But honesty was all she had left. Taking a deep breath, she turned toward the house, the bracelet clutched tightly in her hand. As Emily stepped out into the sunlight, the bracelet shimmered faintly in her hand. She swallowed hard, nerves tightening in her chest. This could be a defining moment, a chance to show her integrity, or a mistake that would cost her the job entirely. Either way, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Clutching the bracelet tightly, Emily walked toward the grand villa's entrance. Her mind raced. What if they think I was trying to steal it? She pushed the thought aside. The only way forward was to face it head on. The villa's interior felt like another world, cool, elegant, and far removed from the harsh sunlight outside. Plush carpets muffled her footsteps as she crossed the foyer, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Everything about the house screamed wealth and refinement, and Emily felt a familiar pang of not belonging. Moving quietly, she paced the open living area, glancing at polished surfaces and gleaming tables. But leaving something so valuable in plain sight felt careless. The coffee table, the sideboards, none of them seemed right. Her gaze drifted toward the staircase. The master bedroom, she thought. That's the safest place. Taking a steadying breath, Emily made her way upstairs. Her heart pounded with each step, echoing in the otherwise silent corridor. The second floor stretched out in both directions. Room after room, she carefully cracked open doors, peeking inside guest bedrooms and studies. Finally, she reached the far end where a door slightly ajar caught her attention. Steeling her nerves, Emily gently pushed it open. She barely had time to register the lavish space before her eyes locked with someone else's. Standing near the wardrobe, mid-buttoning a crisp white dress shirt, was Lucas Reed. Emily froze. Lucas, one of the most famous actors in Hollywood, stared at her in equal surprise, his brow lifting in question. The floor seemed to vanish beneath Emily's feet. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over herself in her rush to leave. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. I should have knocked. I didn't realize anyone was here. I'm sorry, Mr. Reed." Her thoughts raced wildly. "I'm going to get fired. I'll lose this job. And then what?" Lucas's expression softened almost instantly. To her astonishment, his voice was calm, gentle. "It's all right," he said, buttoning the last of his shirt. "Take a breath. What's this about?" Emily's hands trembled as she extended the bracelet. I found this," she managed, barely louder than a whisper. "It was at the bottom of the pool. I thought it might be important." Lucas's eyes flickered with recognition the moment he saw it. A flash of genuine gratitude crossed his face as he stepped forward to take it. "I've been searching for this," he said, his voice warming. "I thought it was gone for good." Lucas held the bracelet up, inspecting it under the light. His gaze softened further as he turned it over in his hands. "This was a gift from my mother," he said quietly. "It means a great deal to me." Emily felt the tension ease from her shoulders. Her breath steadied as she allowed herself a faint smile. "I'm glad I could return it," she replied, relief creeping into her tone. For a moment, the two stood in a comfortable silence. The heaviness of their earlier embarrassment seemed to lift. Then, without thinking, Emily spoke again. "I understand how important things like that can be," she said softly. "My mother, she has a few pieces of jewelry from her grandmother. They're not worth much, but to her, they're everything." As soon as the words left her mouth, Emily regretted them. Her cheeks flushed. "What am I doing? Why am I telling him this? I'm sorry," she added quickly, taking a step toward the door. "I didn't mean to bother you. I should get back to my work." Before she could disappear, Lucas's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, his tone gentle. "It's all right. You don't have to rush off. I don't mind the company." Emily hesitated, caught between wanting to leave and the strange comfort of his kindness. Still overwhelmed, she offered a polite nod. "Thank you, Mr. Reed, but I really should get back to my duties," she said, already inching toward the door. Lucas smiled faintly. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for bringing this back to me. You've done more than enough." Emily hurried down the hallway, her pulse still racing. Relief washed over her, but embarrassment lingered in equal measure. As she returned to her duties, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had left an unexpected mark. Maybe he's not like the others, she thought, recalling his calm, understanding demeanor. But for now, she focused on what mattered, proving herself, one task at a time. Emily's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she stepped back into the backyard, the encounter with Lucas Reed still fresh in her mind. She forced herself to shake off the lingering awkwardness and refocused on the task at hand. There was no time to dwell, she had work to finish. Retrieving the pool skimmer and broom, Emily methodically resumed cleaning. The steady rhythm of sweeping and clearing helped calm her nerves. She moved with quiet determination, brushing away leaves, bits of food, and anything else that didn't belong. By the time she finished with the patio, she had found a strange sense of peace in the simple act of tidying. Gathering the debris into a garbage bag, Emily tied it securely and carried it to the back of the property, disposing of it near the service entrance. The sun hung high overhead now, signaling noon. As Emily wiped her hands on the edge of her uniform, her stomach growled, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten since the stale pastry that morning. She brushed the hunger aside. I can eat later, she told herself. Work first. But as she wandered back inside, she spotted Greg Carver in the kitchen, issuing orders to the staff with his usual brusque demeanor. Taking a breath, Emily approached cautiously. "Excuse me, Mr. Carver," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I finished cleaning the backyard and pool area." Greg's eyes flicked to his watch. He grunted in acknowledgement. "It's just after 11, he said curtly. "Take an early lunch break, but remember, temporary staff provide their own meals. You're not part of the permanent crew." Emily's stomach dropped. In her rush to make it to the villa, she hadn't thought to bring food. I didn't bring anything," she admitted quietly. Greg's brows drew together in irritation. "It was in the message," he replied, crossing his arms. "You're supposed to read the details, not just show up." Emily felt her cheeks flush with shame. Greg sighed, clearly exasperated. "Fine, you've got 40 minutes. Go grab something outside if you need to, but be back on time. I'll need you to cover for the others later." "Thank you," Emily whispered. She turned to leave, panic settling in. "I don't have any money." Her thoughts scrambled for solutions. She could either skip lunch or... Her eyes drifted toward the alley leading to the Silver Spoon. No, she thought, the very idea filling her with shame. But as her stomach twisted with hunger, Emily knew she had little choice. With a heavy heart, she began walking back toward the restaurant's bins. The irony wasn't lost on her. Working at a luxury villa by day, scavenging for food by noon. By the time she reached the alley, Emily swallowed her pride and approached the overflowing trash bags. She crouched near the familiar spot, carefully peeling back one of the bags in search of something edible. But fate was unkind. The moment she tugged at the bag, it split apart, the foul-smelling contents bursting forth and splattering her uniform. Emily gasped, stumbling backward. The putrid liquid soaked her clothes, seeping into the fabric and staining it beyond repair. "No, no, no," she muttered frantically, dabbing at the mess with the napkins she salvaged nearby. But no amount of wiping could remove the smell, or the humiliation that burned deeper than the stain itself. Her hands trembled as she checked the time. Lunch break was slipping away fast. Emily stood frozen, trying to decide whether to return to the villa. The rational part of her knew there was no hiding what had happened, but the fear of facing Greg, and worse, Lucas Reed, made her hesitate. Still, she had no other option. With shaky steps, Emily began the walk back, her mind racing for excuses, none of which felt plausible. As the villa loomed in sight, she prayed she could slip in unnoticed. But luck, once again, was not on her side. A line of sleek cars wound up the driveway. Guests, well-dressed and glamorous, stepped out, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they approached the main entrance. Emily froze, desperately wishing she could vanish into the ground. One of the guests, a woman in a pearl-colored coat, spotted her first. Her eyes widened, and she recoiled in visible disgust. "Oh my God," the woman gasped, clutching at her scarf. "What is that smell?" Emily's heart plummeted. More guests turned to stare. Some stepped aside, while others exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring among themselves. A few covered their noses, fanning the air in exaggerated gestures. Emily felt every pair of eyes lock onto her, each one another dagger to her already fragile composure. "Keep moving," she told herself. "Don't stop." Her pace quickened, but before she could retreat to the back entrance, she caught sight of Lucas stepping out of the front door. His gaze swept across the scene, his polite smile faltering as his eyes landed on her. For a brief, horrible moment, their eyes met. Lucas's brows knitted together, not in disgust, but in quiet concern. Emily's face burned hotter than ever. Emily stood frozen as the guests gave her a wide berth, their murmurs of confusion and disgust trailing behind them as they hurried into the villa. Her stained uniform clung to her, the foul smell lingering in the crisp air. And then, just when she thought she couldn't sink any lower, Lucas Reed appeared at the front entrance. He was dressed sharply, a dark suit tailored to perfection, ready to welcome his high-profile guests. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene. Emily, drenched in waste, standing out like a stain against the pristine elegance of the estate. To his credit, Lucas's expression never shifted into embarrassment or anger. He stepped forward smoothly, raising a hand to calm the situation. "Please, go on inside," he said to the guests with practiced ease. "My staff will take care of everything. I apologize for the inconvenience." His voice was calm, authoritative. The guests hesitated but eventually filed in, still murmuring among themselves. Emily barely had a chance to exhale before she heard commotion from the service entrance. Greg Carver stormed toward her, his face livid, turning a deep shade of red. "What in God's name have you done?" he bellowed, grabbing Emily's arm and yanking her toward the back of the house. His grip was tight, his nails digging into her skin as he pulled her along. "Have you been rolling in garbage?" he snapped, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Or was it some kind of personal challenge to humiliate me in front of Lucas Reed's guests?" Emily tried to explain, her words stumbling out in a panicked rush, but Greg wasn't interested in listening. "Unbelievable," he hissed, dragging her further out of view. "I gave you one job, and you managed to make a spectacle of yourself." Tears pricked at Emily's eyes, but she bit down on her lip to hold them back. Greg shoved her toward the staff showers, glaring. "Clean yourself up," he spat, "and pray that Mr. Reed doesn't fire all of us because of your incompetence." Emily barely managed a nod before stepping into the shower room, the heavy door closing behind her with a thud. Only then, alone and away from Greg's harsh gaze, did the tears fall. She peeled off the ruined uniform, her movements slow and mechanical. The steaming water cascaded over her, but it didn't bring the comfort she expected. No matter how much she scrubbed, she felt the humiliation clinging to her like a second skin. By the time she stepped out, her eyes were red, her face pale. A new uniform had been left outside the door. Emily slipped it on, but dread pooled in her stomach as she realized it was too small. The sleeves tugged uncomfortably at her shoulders, and the buttons strained against her chest. Better this than nothing, she thought bitterly. Greg was waiting for her when she reappeared, his eyes raking over her appearance, his mouth twisted in displeasure. "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice low and threatening. "One more incident like this, and you're gone. No excuses, no second chances. Understand?" Emily nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Good," Greg snapped. "Now get to the foyer. You're on canapé duty, and if one thing is out of place, you'll regret it." He stormed off, leaving Emily alone in the narrow hallway. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the dining area, where trays of appetizers awaited arrangement. She moved carefully, her trembling hands aligning the canapés in neat rows, but the weight of Greg's threat pressed on her shoulders. A voice whispered in the back of her mind, "Maybe you aren't cut out for this. Maybe you'll never escape that alley." Emily shook her head sharply. "No, I'm not giving up. Not now." She pressed on, focusing intently on the delicate task, one canapé at a time. The sound of approaching footsteps made her glance up. Lucas was making his way toward her, his expression softer than before. Emily's cheeks flushed again, heat rising to her face. "How are you holding up?" Lucas asked gently, his tone lacking any trace of judgment. Emily forced herself to stand straighter, offering a polite nod. "I'm fine, Mr. Reed. Thank you for asking. I'm sorry for the trouble I caused." Lucas waved off the apology. "These things happen. It's how we handle them that matters." He paused for a moment, studying her as if debating whether to say more. "If you don't mind me asking," Lucas said carefully, "what exactly happened? You seemed fine earlier when you returned the bracelet." Emily's heart raced. For a moment she considered telling him everything, about her mother's illness, her car parked behind the bistro, and how hunger had driven her back to the alley during her break. But fear crept in, twisting around her words. Instead, she forced a tight smile and lied. "I spilled takeout," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize how bad the smell was until I got back." Lucas studied her for a long moment. Emily wasn't sure if he believed her or not. Finally, he nodded. "Well," Lucas said, offering a faint smile, "next time, let someone know if you need a break. We all have bad days." Emily swallowed hard, guilt knotting in her chest. "Yes, sir, thank you," she replied softly, lowering her gaze back to the canapés. As Lucas walked away, she felt the tightness in her throat linger. Emily carefully placed the final canapé on the tray, her hands steady, but her mind still replaying her conversation with Lucas Reed. His calm demeanor, so different from Greg Carver's sharpness, had left an impression. Lucas's trust, however small, felt like a lifeline. "I won't let you down," she had promised him, and she meant it. But just as she was settling into a steady rhythm, her phone buzzed on the counter. She froze. Emily knew the rules. No personal calls during work. Greg had hammered that point home on her first day. Still, something told her to check. Her heart sank when she saw the caller ID. The hospital. Her fingers trembled as she stepped away from the canapé table. "Hello," she answered, her voice barely audible. "Is this Emily Bennett?" A nurse's voice came through, gentle but urgent. "Yes," Emily replied, already feeling the cold weight of dread. "I'm calling about your mother, Mrs. Wire, Rosa Bennett. I'm afraid there's been a complication." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "She's developed severe internal bleeding. Her condition is critical. We need to perform emergency surgery immediately. Without it, the risk of organ failure is significant." The nurse's words blurred as Emily's world tilted. "Do we have your consent for the procedure?" the nurse pressed. "Yes," Emily whispered, clutching the edge of the counter for support. "Please, do whatever you need to." The call ended, leaving Emily in stunned silence. She glanced around the lavish foyer, the perfectly placed canapés, the polished marble floors, the faint hum of luxury all around her. Her mother was fighting for her life, and she was here arranging hors d'oeuvres for strangers. The decision came swiftly. Without a word to anyone, Emily set down the tray. Her feet carried her out of the villa, down the driveway, and onto the street before she even realized she was moving. Greg's anger, the job, the potential fallout, all of it faded beneath the single pressing thought. Get to the hospital. Her ill-fitting uniform chafed as she walked, but Emily didn't care. She prayed silently as she hurried down the road. Please, let her be okay. Please. By the time Emily reached the hospital, her heart hammered with exhaustion and fear. The sterile corridors stretched endlessly as she made her way to the intensive care unit. The smell of disinfectant and the distant beeping of monitors filled her senses, grounding her in the stark reality of where she was. At the nurse's station, a woman with kind eyes looked up. "Emily Bennett?" the nurse asked softly. "Yes," Emily said, breathless. The nurse's expression softened. "Your mother is out of surgery. The doctors were able to stop the bleeding. She's stable for now." Relief hit Emily so hard her knees nearly gave out. She leaned against the counter, struggling to keep the tears at bay. "Can I see her?" Emily asked, her voice cracking. "She's unconscious, but you can sit with her for a few minutes. Follow me." Emily trailed behind the nurse, the weight of fear and exhaustion lifting slightly with each step. When she finally entered the room, the sight of her mother lying pale but breathing filled her heart with gratitude. Emily approached quietly, taking her mother's frail hand into her own. "I'm here, Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be okay." She sat there for a long time, holding her mother's hand and listening to the steady beeping of the heart monitor. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After a while, the nurse returned, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "I'm sorry," the nurse said. "I need to go over some paperwork with you about the surgery and ongoing care." Emily nodded reluctantly and followed her back to the station. As the nurse explained the costs, Emily's heart sank once more. The emergency surgery alone was more than she could hope to earn in a year, and there would be more. Follow-up treatments, medications, and rehabilitation. Numbers blurred together as Emily tried to process it all. When the nurse handed her the forms, Emily's hands shook. How am I going to pay for this? But she signed the papers without hesitation. Her mother was alive. That was what mattered. Emily returned to the ICU, sitting once more by her mother's side. Her job at the villa felt like a distant memory, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing question. What now? Emily's eyes blurred as she stared at the hospital bill, the numbers swimming on the page, the weight of it pressed down on her like an anchor. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and dread curled in her stomach when she saw the caller ID. Greg Carver. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She already knew what he would say. Taking a deep breath, she answered, "Where the hell are you?" Greg's voice thundered, so loud Emily flinched. She held the phone away from her ear as his tirade continued. "You walked out in the middle of your shift. Do you have any idea how unprofessional that is?" I'm sorry, Mr. Carver," Emily stammered. "There was an emergency. My mother." "I don't want to hear your excuses," Greg snapped, cutting her off. "I warned you. I said one more mistake and you were out. Well, consider yourself fired. Get your stuff out of here, and don't bother asking for a reference." Before she could say anything else, the line went dead. Emily stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. I knew this could happen, she told herself. But it still hurts. The nurse at the station must have noticed her pale face because she offered a sympathetic smile. There are payment plans, the nurse said gently. We can work something out, and there may be financial aid options. Emily forced a nod, barely hearing her. Thank you, she murmured. She signed the last of the paperwork with a trembling hand, then returned to her mother's side. Sitting by the hospital bed, Emily clutched her mother's hand, her chest tightening with fear. I did the right thing, she whispered, as much to reassure herself as anyone else. But the hollow feeling wouldn't leave. After an hour of silent reflection, Emily knew she couldn't avoid the villa forever. She had to retrieve her things. With a heavy heart, she kissed her mother's forehead. I'll be back soon, Mom, she whispered, brushing her thumb over her mother's hand before slipping out of the room. The walk back to the villa felt longer than before, each step heavier with dread. As Emily approached the service entrance, she froze at the sight of Lucas Reed stepping out of his car. Their eyes met. Concern flickered in Lucas's gaze, but there was something else. Disappointment. Emily, Lucas called, his voice calm but firm. I was worried when you disappeared. Greg told me what happened. Her throat tightened. I'm sorry, Mr. Reed, she began, her voice trembling. My mother needed surgery, and I should have told someone. Lucas's expression softened, but before he could reply, Greg stormed out from behind the villa, his face flushed with frustration. Mr. Reed, Greg said quickly, I'll deal with this. I'll have a talk with the staff to ensure. Lucas raised a hand, silencing him. Greg shot Emily a withering glare. Come with me, Greg growled, yanking her by the arm and dragging her toward the service entrance. Emily didn't resist. The moment they were out of sight, Greg slammed the door shut behind them. Let me make this clear, Greg seethed, his voice low but venomous. You're not welcome in my agency anymore. You've proven you can't handle this kind of work. Emily flinched but held her ground. I just came to get my things, she said quietly. That's all. Greg sneered. Your uniform and shoes are by the security post. We put them outside. You reeked, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Take them and leave. Emily nodded, keeping her head down. As she gathered the bundle of clothes and shoes, she felt Lucas's gaze from across the driveway. For a fleeting second, she considered explaining everything. Her homelessness, her mother's illness, the impossible choices she had been forced to make. But the words never came. Instead, she hugged the soiled clothes to her chest like armor. I'm sorry, Mr. Reed, she said softly, avoiding his eyes. Greg's right. I wasn't fit for the job. Thank you for the opportunity. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, each step pulling her further from the one place she thought could offer stability. The harsh afternoon light felt like a cruel reminder of her failures. By the time Emily returned to her car, parked behind the Silver Spoon, the alley felt suffocating. She tossed the uniform onto the passenger seat, slumping against the steering wheel. Tears welled up, hot and relentless. How could I mess this up so badly? The villa job had been a chance to pull herself out of this endless spiral. Now it was gone. Her stomach growled, snapping her back to reality. Emily wiped her eyes, realizing she hadn't eaten since morning. She glanced at the rearview mirror. The alley bin sat just a few feet away, untouched since she left. Her heart sank, but she grabbed her chipped melamine plate from the glove box and stepped outside. The alley was quiet as she approached the bins. Pushing aside the stench and her pride, Emily dug through until she found a discarded half sandwich wrapped in foil. She sat on the curb, tears rolling down her cheeks as she took a bite. It wasn't much, but it would keep her going. For now. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped her chipped plate. The cold metal of the alley bins, a familiar but unwelcome sight. Hunger gnawed at her, but the weight of humiliation pressed even harder. She stepped forward, but before she could peel back the plastic bag, the rumble of a car approaching made her freeze. The sleek black vehicle came to a stop just a few feet away. Emily's heart plummeted. The driver's door opened, and Lucas Reed stepped out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lucas's eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight before him. Emily standing in the alley, clutching the plate, her clothes still faintly marked from the incident earlier. Gone was the maid he had seen that morning. In her place stood someone who was unmistakably homeless. Emily, Lucas's voice was soft, a mix of confusion and concern. What are you doing here? The question, simple and innocent, shattered the fragile wall she had been holding up. Emily's gaze dropped to the ground. She gestured weakly toward the car parked just behind the alley, its windows lined with old blankets. I live here, she whispered. Lucas's eyes followed the motion. His expression shifted, realization settling in as he noticed the pile of belongings stacked behind the backseat window and the threadbare curtain blocking out the rear view. His brow furrowed with something Emily feared the most, pity. Her throat tightened. Before she could stop herself, the dam broke. Tears spilled down her face as she choked out the words she had been holding in for months. I'm so sorry, she sobbed, the plate trembling in her hands. I didn't mean to lie. I needed the job so badly. My mom, she's sick. Leukemia had surgery today, and I don't know how I'm going to pay for it. Lucas took a cautious step forward, his hand outstretched but hovering uncertainly in the air. Emily wiped her eyes, still unable to meet his gaze. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. And then today, when everything went wrong, I panicked. I knew I'd lose the job, and I didn't know what else to do. Lucas was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. Emily, he said gently, I had no idea. Why didn't you say something sooner? She shook her head. I didn't want anyone to know how far I'd fallen. Lucas exhaled slowly, as if trying to choose his next words carefully. I understand, he said at last, but you don't have to carry this alone. He took a step closer, his tone firm but compassionate. Come with me, Lucas said, gesturing to his car. Let's talk somewhere else. This isn't the place for it. Emily hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to refuse. Pride, fear, and habit told her to stay in the shadows, to retreat to the safety of her car. But the flicker of hope in Lucas's eyes pulled at her. With a small nod, she followed him, leaving the alley behind. The warmth inside Lucas's car was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Emily sat stiffly, clutching the plate to her chest as if it could shield her from reality. As the car rumbled to life, the words began to pour out. She told Lucas everything, the diagnosis, the mounting bills, the eviction. How she had been living in her car for months, surviving off discarded food from the alley behind the Silver Spoon. When she mentioned her mother's emergency surgery that morning, Lucas's expression darkened with quiet empathy. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I understand more than you think. I lost my sister to leukemia. Emily's eyes widened. I didn't know, she said softly. I'm so sorry for your loss. Lucas nodded, his smile faint but sincere. It was a long time ago, he admitted, but the pain never really goes away. That's why I started a foundation, to help families going through the same thing. As the villa's gates came into view, Lucas slowed the car, turning to face her. I've made a decision, Emily, he said, his voice calm but resolute. Her heart pounded. I want to help you, Lucas continued. First, I'm reinstating your job. You'll work directly for me, no agency, no Greg. I'll make sure you're paid properly. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. You'd really do that? She stammered. There's still plenty of daylight left, Lucas said with a small smile. We can finish the event preparations. Emily's heart soared, but Lucas wasn't finished. More importantly, he added, I want to cover your mother's medical bills through my foundation. I know how overwhelming this can be, and I don't want you to go through it alone. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. Mr. Reed, I don't know what to say, she whispered. Thank you doesn't seem enough. Lucas's warm smile returned. Call me Lucas, he said. And there's no need to thank me. We all need a little help sometimes. As the car pulled into the villa driveway, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. As Emily stepped out of the car, she instinctively smoothed her wrinkled uniform, her cheeks flushed with the memory of earlier humiliation. I should change before I go back in, she murmured. Lucas Reed shook his head with a soft smile. You don't need to wear that uniform anymore, he said. You're not with Greg's agency now. You're my staff. We'll get you something new. Emily's eyes drifted to the front seat where a half-eaten sandwich rested in the cup holder. She quickly looked away, embarrassed by the gnawing hunger she hoped to conceal. But Lucas noticed. I'll have the staff prepare lunch for you when we get inside, he said gently. Thank you, she whispered, recalling Greg's harsh rule about temporary staff not being allowed to eat at the villa. Lucas's kindness was a stark contrast to everything she had experienced. As they approached the service entrance, Emily's stomach twisted in nervous anticipation. She knew Greg wouldn't take this quietly. Sure enough, Greg was waiting, his arms crossed, and his eyes narrowed as they walked up. His barely contained anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Mr. Reed," Greg began, forcing a tight smile. "I removed this woman earlier. Now she's returned." "She's with me, Greg," Lucas replied simply, "but she abandoned her post in the middle of preparation." Greg snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We can't have staff walking out whenever they feel like it." Lucas raised his hand, cutting him off. "I'm aware of the situation," he said evenly, "and I've made my decision. Emily will stay. She's working directly for me now." Greg's face darkened. "But sir," Lucas's calm but firm tone left no room for argument. "The agency won't be needed anymore," he continued. "After today's event, I'm terminating the contract. I'll handle things in-house moving forward." Greg's mouth opened and closed several times, his shock palpable. "But who will manage the staff? Who will ensure things run smoothly?" Greg sputtered. Lucas glanced over at a tall, poised man standing nearby. "Micah can handle it," Lucas said. Micah, the butler who had been quietly overseeing the staff for years, stepped forward with a polite nod. His calm demeanor was the complete opposite of Greg's. "I'll take over and ensure everything runs as expected, Mr. Reed," Micah said smoothly. "It would be my pleasure." Greg glared at Emily one last time before storming off, muttering under his breath. Emily exhaled, the weight on her chest lifting slightly as she watched him disappear. "Thank you," she said softly, turning to Lucas. He smiled. "I know you won't let me down." Micah stepped forward and motioned for Emily to follow him. "Come, I'll show you to your new room," Micah said with kindness in his eyes. Emily blinked in disbelief as she stepped into the small, cozy room in the staff quarters. A real bed, a small desk, even a wardrobe. "This will be yours," Micah said, placing a key on the bedside table. "You'll find everything you need here." Emily ran her fingers along the edge of the bed, unable to believe this space belonged to her. "It's more than I expected," she admitted, her voice trembling. Micah smiled knowingly. "Once you're settled, I'll show you your duties for tonight's event," he said. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt hope. Over the next few hours, Micah patiently trained Emily. His teaching style was calm and thorough, a refreshing change from Greg's abrasive methods. "You can always come to me or Mr. Reed if you need anything," Micah reassured her. "We're here to support you." Emily nodded. "I won't run off again," she promised, embarrassed by her earlier departure. I panicked." Micah chuckled lightly. "We all have moments like that," he said. "The important thing is that you're here now." As the evening's event drew closer, Emily threw herself into preparation. She carefully arranged hors d'oeuvres, double-checked seating arrangements, and polished glassware until every surface gleamed. Despite the chaos, Emily felt a sense of belonging. That evening, as the guests began to arrive, Emily moved gracefully through the crowd, serving drinks and tending to their needs. She caught Lucas's eye several times, and each time he gave her an encouraging smile. His quiet reassurance made her want to work even harder. By the time the last guest left, Emily felt exhausted but accomplished. She stood in the corner of the dining hall, wiping down the last of the silver trays when Lucas approached. "You did a wonderful job tonight," Lucas said, his voice warm. Emily straightened, offering him a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she said. "I feel hopeful for the first time in a while." Lucas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I've already arranged for your mother's medical care," he said. "Tomorrow, if you'd like, we'll visit her together." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to," Lucas replied gently. "Just keep doing your best. That's all the thanks I need." As Emily made her way back to her new room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Emily lay on the soft mattress, staring up at the ceiling of her new room. The warmth of the blankets wrapped around her felt almost surreal. It was the first time in months she hadn't fallen asleep to the hum of traffic or the cold bite of night air seeping through the cracked windows of her car. Her life had shifted in the span of a single day. so much so that she could hardly believe it. She was no longer sleeping in the alley behind the silver spoon, no longer waking up under a worn blanket, afraid of what the day would bring. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt safe. She rolled onto her side, gazing at the small desk and the modest wardrobe Micah had shown her earlier. This room, though simple, represented more than just shelter. It was a fresh start. Emily thought of her mother lying in the hospital, resting after surgery. Tomorrow, she would visit her, not as someone who had failed to hold on to her job, but as someone with renewed purpose. Someone who could stand tall. Lucas's kindness had lifted her from rock bottom, offering her a chance she thought she would never have. A lump formed in her throat as she thought about how easily the day could have gone differently. If Lucas hadn't found her in the alley. If she had chosen to run instead of facing him. She whispered softly into the quiet room, "I won't waste this." Emily made a silent promise to herself. She would work hard. She would prove to Lucas, to Micah, and most importantly to herself, that she was worthy of this second chance. As exhaustion finally pulled her under, Emily closed her eyes, feeling lighter than she had in months. Tomorrow held new challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face them. Hope had returned, and that was enough to carry her forward.